All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and a happy Sabbath to you. It is good to be back at the Pastor's Roundtable for our very last segment. What do we call it? Episode of season 1. This is the very last one, gentlemen. We were a little running behind late today. I had to be in, technically I was in Jamaica today doing a baptism with the West Jamaica Conference. So I had to rush home and try to get things together. We didn't get our shares out like we normally like to do. So we want to invite you, those of you that are watching, we need your help today to get these shares out because you do not want to miss what's going to be happening on today's program. So you want to make sure that if you're here, we want to know that you're here in the chat. If you just shout out, let us know where you're watching from, and maybe the name of your church, just shout that out. But also we need you to share. We need you to hit that share button so that other people will be able to get on. Normally we send out about, 20 or 30 different shares to try to make sure people know that we are up and going. But we're just going to need your help to help us out this afternoon. Dr. Henry, I'm looking at your background, man. It looks different. What's up? What's going on?
Yeah, well, listen, they say this is a movement, right? So, yeah, it's a movement. So we, my wife and I, we were praying about it, and we are now in transition to Orlando, to the Altamont Springs Church, where we're going to be ministering there. So that's why the background that you see is different. In fact, today was the installation. And it was a good installation. We had the ministerial director here, Pastor Orlando Lopez, and then Pastor Jinks, the vice ministerial director, and we just had a good time. And so that's why the background is different.
Oh, wow. So you are in Florida, back in Florida.
Back in Florida. You know, my family's here, and just back in Florida. So I tell you what, though, I had a wonderful church there in Kansas City. I just want to do a shout out to that church, Beacon Light. No place like Beacon Light. And so I just love my members there, and I know that God is just going to continue to bless them. They did a wonderful going away for me too.
Oh wow!
They did the social distancing and the whole nine. And again, wonderful church, wonderful place to be. And I'm just so glad that I was able to have that opportunity of being there and ministering to the wonderful people there in Kansas City.
Oh, that's awesome.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to go there. I'm going to go preach next week and tell them how bad a person you are. And
Mercy.
I'm going to have the privilege of going and stepping in the midst, in the transitional period there with you, And I was trying to think about what's the best sermon to share. About maybe a pastor is a gift from God, or the man we have is all these things are going through my head. I'm not sure what I'm going to do, but we definitely going to go and lift you up and thank God for your leadership there. And it sounds as they are already missing you. So we'll definitely let them know that you send your greetings from the Pastors Roundtable.
Definitely. Wonderful church.
Good stuff. Hey, so listen, let's talk right quick before we get into today's stuff. Last week we had Carmela Monk Crawford, the editor of Message Magazine, and we had Dr. Sandra Roberts, the president of the Southeastern California Conference. So what'd you guys think? How did it go?
Man, the show actually blew me away in terms of the presentation, the words of wisdom, the vulnerability that was shared. Yeah. Just being able to attack an issue in our church and not come at it from such a negative perspective. It was a real good conversation. I really appreciate our two guests. One of our viewers wrote in the chat that those two ladies were the right guests we needed to have for that topic.
Yeah, and the experience, as you said, of our guests, especially the president of Southeastern, Dr. Sandra. She did an awesome job just giving us that experience that she continues to have with, her being a leader, being a female, and some of the challenges that she has faced. But through it all, strong leader, strong leadership. And, what more can we say about Carmela Monk Crawford? Just a powerful witness. And what she gave to the table was great. So I enjoyed last show. I think last show was one of our good shows. Like, good combination of experience and also talking about going through some of these obstacles and how to challenge the system in different ways. I thought it was real good.
What was just so fascinating was to hear that story from Dr. Roberts of having to be snuck inside the General Conference building by a security guard because women weren't allowed, or at least not in that particular meeting. Not in general. Don't misquote me. Not in general, but in some particular meeting that she had to be snuck inside. And listen, I'm excited that the church is moving in a direction that is really affirming the role that everybody has to play in preaching this gospel. One of the comments that stuck out to me last week came from a friend of mine from Forest Lake. We were at Forest Lake together. George, Jorge, he's a military chaplain, and he said, look, in the military, when it comes to mission, like, you find the best person to do the job. You don't care about race. You don't care about, whatever. It's the person that gets the job done the best. And so it was just a very, very enlightening. I found people at the end of last week's show who did not even know that we had a female conference president in the church, period.
Wow.
So it was enlightening to them. So listen, that was last week. We had a great show last week, or great program discussion last week, but I'm excited about today. So what's going on today, you guys? Today, well, first let me say this. Today's program came from you, our listeners, our guests. You guys said that you wanted us to have this particular program. Roger, what are we doing today, man?
Well, we're continuing the conversation on mission and the structure of the church, and looking at it from the structure, from the ethnic structure. But what is interesting about this is that when we had this conversation before, we were not able to have a Caucasian's perspective on it, or Caucasian pastor on it. So we decided, hey, based on the comments we had, we're going to do a show on it. So we are so blessed today to have two Caucasian pastors who are going to join us and share from that perspective about the ethnic structures in our church.
All right. So who do we have, Dion? Who do we have on the show? We've given a little hint, but who is it?
All right. Well, let's see if I can do a good job here. First of all, we have Tim Floyd, Pastor Tim Floyd. I was privileged to hear a presentation from him a couple of years ago in the Mighty Central States Conference. And I think he did a wonderful job. He is in the Kansas-Nebraska conference, Kansas-Nebraska, and just doing a wonderful job. He actually, at one point, was one of the pastors, I think, at Forest Lake. Am I right? So,
hold on. They can't see him. Let me bring him on so folk can see him. Here they come.
Oh, yeah,
gotta get him on. Here we go. Drum roll and boom. They do exist.
I hope I'm not disappointing.
All right. So we don't have the name tags today, Dion, and we moved you around. So Tim, they don't know who's Tim and who's who. So there we go. All right.
Wave your hand to him. There you go.
I'm Dion. Good to be here.
Actually, our next guest, he is a pistol. If that can be said.
Agitator is what we said last time.
Agitator. Many of you may already know of him. His name is Pastor Ryan Becker. He hails from Chattanooga. He's there at the Crosswalk Seventh-day Adventist Church, or Crosswalk Fellowship. I'm not sure what title they go by there, but he is one of the pastors there at the Crosswalk Church, and he's well versed in what we're doing here, in dialoguing and sharing information. That is kind of his other the passion, I should say. And so you'll hear more about it as we go along, but we're glad to have Pastor Becker and Pastor Floyd with us. And I need to jump out and say this. I'm going to I got to be the Holy Spirit today in some way, shape, or form. So I'll be back and forth, but I will be following the discussion. But we're just looking forward to the discussion as we move forward in God.
All right. I am seeing a text in the chat on YouTube. YouTube chat from, oh man, I gotta hope I say this right, because these are my people from Trinidad. She says, I'm looking and listening to this episode from the beautiful island of Trinidad. Hey, there's two Trinis on here. In the Caribbean. I have shared this information with my family and friends who will be on for the first time. So we want to welcome some of our first time viewers.
I, in a very vulnerable and that's my mom who's watching. So.
All right.
She's very
Keep
much
it in the
a fan
family.
of the Pastors Roundtable.
Awesome. So look, so we're going to tell you guys this is what we're doing. So you guys asked us, or you all asked us we had this discussion with the president of Oakwood University, Leslie Pollard, with the president of the Pacific Union Conference, Pastor Ricardo Graham, and with the associate director for ministerial at the North American Division, Pastor Jose Cortez. And what you guys said was, wow, this was a great discussion, but we'd like to hear, as Dion mentioned earlier, we'd like to hear from some of our white pastors. And so what we're doing today is we're asking them essentially the same questions. We don't really have new questions that are written out. So we're going to give them the same questions that we went through a couple of weeks back to Dr. Pollard, that we gave to Dr. Pollard and Elder Graham and Elder Cortez. So that's how we're going to roll today. Roger's got to step out for just a minute, as he mentioned, but he'll be back and forth, and we'll bring him back in when he comes. So we're going to, Roger, just before you go, if you could have a word of prayer for us before we begin.
Sure, let's pray. Father, again, we are putting this opportunity into your hands. We ask you to use us, use our guests to share your glory. It's my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 All right, here we go. Doc Henry, are you ready?
Hey, listen, I'm going to try to be.
Hey, all right.
We have a wonderful installation service here, the wonderful Altamont Springs Church. So just trying to transition now and get into this discussion today.
Okay, so Dr. Henry, can we throw you out there? I mean, like out there? Can we out you right now?
Man, listen, hey, do what you try.
I'm gonna do it. Look, the last time that Dr. Henry was with us, Ryan, he was a pastor in a black conference, in a regional conference. Today, he is a pastor in a state conference. He was introduced today, so he is no longer part of the regional conference work. That's going to get you some comments, Dr. Henry. But here we go. So let's just jump right in. So perspectives are very interesting all over the place, and I'm going to be as provocative as I can be today, or maybe not as I can be, but as I think is safe, maybe. All right. So let's go with question number one. So, Tim, Ryan, last couple of weeks back when we had this discussion, we asked our guest to talk about defining the mission of the SDA Church in North America, because we're talking about the intersection of mission and structure, right? So, and one of the things that we do have in this church are ethnic structures. And when I say that, well, let's get to that in a minute, but let's start off with the mission. How would you guys define the mission of the Seventh-day Adventist Church? How would you address that? What would you say is the mission of the church?
Specifically in the NAD or just in general?
Adventist Church, period. Oh, let's do both. Let's go ahead and do both if there's a difference.
Okay, so I'm going to be, if you wanted to be provocative, then I'm just going to go ahead and start that right now. And at a very, very basic level, and I am a pastor, so I understand what I'm about to say here, but like at a basic level, it's to make more Adventists. Like it is to introduce people to Jesus and to reconcile them and to take the uniqueness of the Adventist message to all corners of the world and within the North American division, then within, to all corners of it. But at the end of the day, if as an organization, right, I'm talking about us as like an institution and an organization, not necessarily the religious aspect of it. But if your funding also comes from Adventists, then you kind of have to make more Adventists if you're going to grow. If all you do is make more Christians that do not identify as Adventist, then you're kind of cutting off your own funding source too. And I know that might sound like a bleak way to put it, but that's going to help with something I think a little bit later too. And I'm not trying to be defeatist or cup half empty person here. I just think that at a basic organizational level that we're talking, it's to make more Adventists.
Okay. All right. Hey, look, I got to address this question on the screen. Last week was phenomenal. We need these fantastic women back in season 2. We are going to have more women. We were actually attempted to have some women on this show, just didn't work out. So we're being intentional about trying to make sure that we are inclusive all the way around. Tim, how would you address that question, man? The mission of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, or anybody want to react right quick to Ryan's comment of how he defined that? Okay, that's a no. Let's go with Tim. Okay.
Well, I struggle with it because I think that for, honesty's sake, I think Ryan has hit a pretty honest, brutally honest part of an institution such as ours. Now, if we look at, where we started as a church, the mission, obviously, our history is very clear about the second coming and the Sabbath and the health message and education and service and all the things that we do, and that our efforts to spread that worldwide and to bring people closer to Jesus. Obviously, that's our goal. Mm-hmm. But I can't help but agree with Ryan in some ways to say that there are pockets that theme of just reproduction is really strong. I don't think it's everywhere. I think it depends on the conferences, and I think it depends on the local level, the churches. But I do think there's some truth to that.
Okay. All right. So if the mission of the church is to make more Adventists, then the assumption would be, if we're trying to be on the up and up and trying to be real and legitimate, is that the assumption that is predicated on is that Adventism does introduce people to Jesus Christ. It does usher them into a relationship, a saving relationship with the Lord. And so if we take that part for granted, then absolutely, boom, that is what that ultimately ends up looking like. So if the idea is the mission of the church is to introduce more people to Jesus through the avenue of Adventism, we're saying that is the mission of the church. Then there's the concept, Dr. Henry, that mission ought to be the primary thing that drives everything that we do, right? We've heard that. Can you just talk to us a little bit about that, where mission fits into what we do as an organization?
No, well, let me go back to this. Okay, so interesting dialogue. Is it wrong for the organization to make more Adventists? Mm-hmm. I want to ask that question.
No, I would say. I don't think it's wrong. Like, so the natural thing that what I said was predicated on as well, other than introducing people to Jesus, is the kind of assumption or presumption that being introduced to Jesus is a good thing. That being an Adventist is a good thing, right? There's not, unless you are a criminal or someone who really does have evil intent, then no one tries to recruit more people to a thing that they don't think is good. And so that's why I say, like, I'm not trying to be cup half empty here, but I think there's some realities that we need to face with, as an organization or as an institution, just separate from the idea that we are also a church. But no. I think that making more Adventists is overall, I think it's a good thing, because I think that the core and the heart of Adventism is following Jesus and is seeking Jesus first. So that holds true for me, and it holds true for most other Adventists I know.
Well, and I guess I want to point out Nestor's comment there. The metrics by which we gauge if we're successful or not is usually either money or people. And so, I mean, again, like, that's a part of an institutional thing. That's what growth looks like for us.
Okay. All right. Turn my mic back up there. Yeah.
There you go.
Okay. All right. So let's move then. Let's move then to this next question. Dr. Henry, you asked this question last time. You want to give it another go?
Okay. We're talking about the fiscal survivability and duplication of resources.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So, we had a very engaging discussion a couple of weeks ago about conferences and mission, and we got a lot of feedback from it. So we just want to come to our pastors now to just get your take on it. So people are talking about the duplication. And by the way, I think when we had our last conversations, we discovered that there might be a different emphasis. You know, there's an urban emphasis and so forth.
Yeah.
But based on your perspective, what do you think about the presence of, two conferences in one city, one state? Is there a need to revisit that? The diversity of state and regional conferences covering the same territory? Or do you feel, well, just your perspective on that? How do you feel about that?
Tim, you're just gonna let me go first on all these, and I'm here for it, because I'm jumping at the bit. All right, I'm chomping at the bit. I'm ready.
Conference level, I have more risks.
That's facts. I'm a lay pastor. I have no risk. By the way, I did actually pastor churches full time too, so I don't let's not. And lay pastors are just as important. So let me say this, because I think I think we have a flaw in the way that this conversation is typically approached, in that there's actually really no accurate language that really describes the Adventist situation. Because yes, we have separate conferences, but they're not really segregated, because membership is open and able to be moved between both. There's no restriction outright. Now, there might be restrictions because of underlying prejudices. Do not get me wrong, and I think that really does exist, and that's an issue. But functionally, as an organization, segregation doesn't adequately describe it, I think. But then there's no other word to really describe it. As far as there being multiple conferences overlapping in a territory, I don't see that. If we have an issue with that, then we should also have an issue with multiple churches in a city. But I mean, Ellen White even views it as putting a church on every street corner. You should be able to walk to church very easily. I tend to view, when it comes to overlapping conferences, I tend to view it as very much if they're not against us, right? If they're not against us, then why not? And so for me, I'd say I have no problem with it. The problem I have is when those overlapping conferences see each other as either competition or try to wall each other out for whatever reason, whether that's prejudice on either side. Notice I did not say racism, but prejudice on either side, and or because it really is competition and they are going for the same demographic. But ultimately, if we have an issue with that, we have an issue then with, all the other different kind of special interest groups that we have that represent different racial identities within the Adventist church, especially in North America.
Okay, I got some stuff I want to throw at that, but Tim, what's your thoughts, man? So we're talking about let me throw this in there in the midst, and that might give a little bit more context. So what we often hear is that at the local level, churches don't have the kind of resources that they feel like they need in order to engage the mission, in order to engage making more Adventists or introducing people to Jesus. So at the local level, and so there has been this argument that has gone on for decades that if we were not spending so much money at the conference level or at the union level or at the division level, then maybe there would be more resources available at the local level to be able to engage mission. And so that's the context where this discussion often rises, where you've got a personal ministries person in the conference office in this office in the city, and then another personal ministry, a religious liberty salary, secretary, staff, publications, all of those things that are coming out of two different offices when they're doing the same thing. That's often really where the idea of are we really being not effective, but what's the word I'm looking for? Are we doing the best with our funds that we possibly can in those scenarios? So in that context, we're not asking from a missional point, because that's going to come a little later, but from a purely financial, fiscal resources and survivability, is the duplication, is it merited in this day and age?
Yeah. So I've been trying to wrap my mind around this one for almost 20 years that I've been working for the church in one way or another. Most of my career has been spent either in Adventist education as a chaplain and Bible teacher, or in our churches as a youth pastor. And now at the conference level, I'm hearing a completely different perspective of this conversation. And I hear it in the office, and I hear it in meetings with other youth directors and other leaders of our church. And I'm not quite sure where I stand on it myself. I'll just say that first. I don't know where I stand on it. I know personally, I am a very needy extrovert in that sense of I love people. And I want to be with people, and I enjoy being with people who are different from me. I have learned great things from traveling and exposing myself to people that are just not like me. And I feel like as a leader in our church, I want to promote that concept of unity and togetherness as much as possible in as many venues as I can. I have seen our churches, like Ryan had referenced, we have churches even within the same city that sometimes there's tension between them. And then you add to that a whole other category of same church, different brand, different ways of worship, different of everything. And you end up getting some tensions there naturally. My challenge with this, where I don't know where I settle in, is I have heard some of my friends who are pastors in the regional conference, and some of their positions have been, let's get everyone together, let's come together and all be one big conference. And then I've heard other pastors who are within that same regional conference say, absolutely not, we must be different because we are different and there's different ways of doing things. And then at the other end of that, I hear other conference level people say, man, we need to share resources and pool all of our ideas and our people and be as efficient as possible. And then at the other end of that, in the same office, I hear people say, well, we don't want to take on their debt. And so, or we don't want them to have to take on our debt. And so there's a very real back and forth that I think there's some level of racism that might be involved at an underlying level behind some of those comments. But I also know many of the people are very anti-racist. In the sense of the current use of that word, I don't believe that is their motivator either. And so I really don't know where I stand on this issue. I'm hoping to get some clarity still as I get a little older.
So this is hard for me because I have a metric here that I don't like. I can share, but the person who gave it to me and developed this has asked me like to let it be their privilege to fully release it. So while I do have this, what I'm about to say, sourced out of respect for the person who shared it with me. I'm not going to share the actual source itself right now, but it is researched, it is cited. But tracking with, and this is why I brought up the organizational thing earlier, and I didn't know how we were going to get here. I just trusted that we were, and I was going to find a way to bring this up. Tracking 70 years of membership growth between the NAD without regional conferences and the NAD with regional conferences over the same time period. So from 1948 until 2018, the regional conferences had a growth of 1,563%. The NAD without regional conferences had a growth of 432%. The actual membership growth for regional conferences alone was 16 times what they started with at around 20,000 members.
Wow.
And the NAD without them has grown 4 times what it was at 200, from starting at around 215,000. So from a purely, if we're talking about fiscal responsibility, tell me where the investment is better. As an organization, tell me where the investment is better. Because in my mind, people talk about ending regional conferences, which already I think that's a flawed premise that they have to be, like, that's where we start. But if you're just talking about purely financially speaking, the regional conferences actually seem to be doing better from a financial standpoint, and several of them actually are doing better from a financial standpoint than a lot of our state conferences. And I think that's not something a lot of people realize or know, which is why I shared what I did, but unfortunately I just can't make that source available right now. But that is significant from a purely fiscal responsibility perspective.
Yeah.
So here's I think one of the challenges, I think, when we crunch that kind of data, right? So if you're looking at that data from 1948 or 1940s when regional conferences were initially established, and pushing that same narrative all the way through to now, we keep in mind that, well, this is where this gets messy, Ryan, and you're familiar
Yes.
with this, is that it gets messy in that in a place like where I'm at and where Dion pastors, Florida Conference, the Florida Conference, probably Greater New York Conference, maybe parts of what's the Georgia Cumberland, parts of those areas. If in 1940s, when conferences separated, or when we started having regional conferences, that thing or those churches, what was left was purely white conferences, right? Black people in 1948 were not going to be all up in those state conference churches during that time. However, now what we see in a place like Florida Conference, in a place like Greater New York and other places, you're going to see that it's very difficult to find anything that you could identify as a white church, much less a white conference in that sense. So the data begins to get fuzzy somewhere in between 1948 and 2018. So that the narrative that the data tells from 1948 to 2018, it's not as clear cut as it makes it seem just on the surface, because you've got much more of a mix in what used to be our white conferences now. So then how do you interpret that data? How do you read that in a context like we have right now? In South Florida, I guarantee you, I'm in Fort Lauderdale. I've been to, when I came down to South Florida, I went to the church. I had a few weeks off. I went to the church that I thought was going to be the white church down here. I saw one white person in the church, one, and the church was packed. I went to another that when I moved to Fort Lauderdale, they said that this is the white church in town. They invited me to come speak. There were 3 white people that I saw. 2 of them were guests from out of town, and it's like the other church in town. It's the big church down in Plant. Oh, I'm not going to call. The other church across town, which is supposed to be one of the larger churches. Again, I've gone there, and very few, if any at all, white people in the congregation. So when we're talking about these differences in finances and what have you, it's not as clear cut as it may have been in times past. So what do we do with that?
Well, Pastor Paul, first of all, it seems like you need to be a guest on the show. like you got some passion.
That was a question. That was a question. I was developing a question.
That's an opinion and a question together, right?
No,
So,
that was a question. How do you?
I think what and I'm hearing the conversation here, and I think that what we can from that data that was given is that regional conferences are effective. I think we could all say they are effective.
But Pastor Henry, Dr. Henry, that was the point of the question. The point of the question, Dr. Henry.
Wait, hold on one second. I think the deeper issue is what I think my passion is about is what is when we talk about the growth in North America and we talk about the ethnic growth. I think one of the things that I'm concerned about and want to find more information about is it seems to be that the Caucasian population is not growing as fast as we would like it to grow. And so the obstacles on why that's not happening, what's working, and if there's something that we can do, because remember, we're trying to win all people, right? Mm-hmm. And so what can we do so that we can make this church a place where all people can grow?
And what message does it send for us to be separated as, according to Pew, the most diverse denomination in Christianity in the United States? What message is that sending that we are, in fact, still segregated?
Right. And I think... go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, Anselm, I would answer your question directly by saying that without having to go too deep into it, because I don't have the full kind of document or the full listing here of the breakdown of the data. I would say that the margin of error on this data is definitely not as high as 1,000%, which is the discrepancy between the two. I would say that there's still a lot of room for this to be true, that regional conferences had more growth. The one metric that I don't have is this counting people who transferred between a regional conference and a state conference or back and forth. So that there is something to be said about that. But I don't think that the margin of error is still 1,000. But okay. So I used to, people would ask me, what do I see as the difference between a black church and a white church? And you need go no further than even, I think, Oakwood to demonstrate this as like an easily accessible church stream and church programming. To say that the main way that I used to describe this, and probably still would, is that a black church tends to have everyone worshiping together, whereas a whiter church that even would go as, let's go as stereotypical as you want and uses contemporary music like just straight up Hillsong or Elevation Worship or Bethel or one of those, right? Is that you have a lot of white people worshiping individually together. There's a much more communal or familial aspect. Yeah. And if I had to trace it to one specific thing,
culture,
I would trace it back to the GI Bill.
Oh, wow.
I would trace this back to white Americans being basically catapulted into the suburban middle class, which allowed them more space, more boundary, more barrier between them and anyone else. That naturally began to silo white people.
From each other, you're talking about?
From each other, yes, from each other and from everyone else. Because now, right, with Trump undoing part of what Obama put into the Equal Housing or the Fair Housing Act, you've got. I watched this debate ramp back up of white people saying, no, we don't want that low income housing near our middle class area because it drives property values down or whatever. But I think that literal physical space and separation is. It has contributed a lot to and has been reflected in our church, whereas black people were not given that same catapult. And I think that combined with this very, very real shared experience of black or history of Black America, of the history of Black America. I mean, you combine all of those factors, and it makes a world of sense to me that we would have a very communal and familial and this kind of togetherness within the black church or any given black church versus your standard or typical white church. Now, there's always exceptions. So if your church is the exception, congratulations. I'm not talking about you. So that is something that I always feel like I have to clarify. But I think that is, I think that's significant in my mind.
But I listened to the question and I listened to the answer, and I appreciate the perspective that you bring, Ryan. But the thing that got me as I moved from the East Coast to the Midwest was that once I got to the Midwest, there were fewer black people, or the blacks were more congregated into the urban settings. But there are a number of churches, white churches, that are out in the rural areas. And as you connect with them, there is a familiarity among those churches, and they tend to be family driven. They tend to be people who have grown up together, worship together. They have farms that are next to each other, ranches that are next to each other, and so somehow there is the same type of connectivity that a black church may have in the urban setting that I see white churches have in a rural setting. But yet still, they're in their own silo. You are correct. They are in their silo because there is no sense of understanding that there is even a regional conference that overlaps that territory. But life goes on without any mindset. So I'm wondering if the data is set up in a way that we can look at it only from when we're in the city, we can see that, we see the growth, it makes sense. But when we're out in the middle of Kansas, and I'm not picking on Kansas here,
but you could.
But when we're out there and we're in the middle of nowhere, I don't want to say it could be Rocky Mountain Conference. No, it could be. I'm just saying when we're out there in the middle of nowhere, there's no sense of growth. Period. Because as you say, they are in a silo, and I'm not seeing white folks move into that city and becoming new Adventists in town, because there's no newness. So the data may be skewed in that kind of sense, depending on where you're looking at it, where you're sitting and looking at it.
And further reinforcing your point, Roger, I think in our research with like the Growing Young Adventist research and youth and young adult retention, it's overwhelmingly a white issue. It's not as much of it's not that it's not existing, but the prevalence in white culture of young people leaving the church is astounding. So if we're losing them and we're not recruiting them, I think people of my skin tone could learn some lessons from the familial culture that exists in other cultures outside of white people.
There's a viewer, Tyrone Burton, says that the divide is as much a class issue as it is culture. How do we see that, the class versus culture? And I'd even throw, and he probably means culture, he probably is including race. Is it just a race issue, just a culture issue, or does class, what role does class play into this thing, Ryan, that you're talking about, as far as that familiarity and that communal type of worship?
I would say class and race both play a role in this. I mean, I was the churches I pastored, Roger, very much echo the sentiments that you've given. Small white church. There was one black person in one of my churches, and she went back and forth between a regional conference church and us, and very passionate about ministry. And I love her. She was one of the members that challenged me the most, which is why I love her. But the reality was, their church, this one church, was in a neighborhood where there were houses literally at the edge of their parking lot, and they were in a neighborhood, but all of the members commuted in from their homes. And even though their homes were at the same income level as the people in the homes around them, they still tended to view those in the homes around the church with this view of contempt, typically. And it was very difficult to even get around that. On top of the fact of being in a neighborhood where they would be the minority, they still were using antiquated racial terms as they were talking about black people and about race relations. Mm-hmm. So it's still siloed. Even when there is the familial aspect, it still ends up being siloed. And so I would say there's a class issue, but I think there's a race issue as well, because we all tend to view ourselves a little bit more favorably. So even when all things are equal, Black people still tend to be viewed as a little bit lower somewhere on that totem pole, tend to. So I just, and that makes me sad. Like that breaks my heart because it's not true. It's absolutely not true. And I think Hispanic churches fall under that kind of same space or same place. So yeah, that's how I would answer that question.
Okay, so we said at the beginning that we were going to deal with kind of defining ethnic structures, and we just flew by it. So I want to throw this out there because it's not exactly, there's more to it, I think, than at face value. So when we say ethnic structures within the Seventh-day Adventist Church, for the most part, we're talking about intentional structures and organic structures, right? The intentional ethnic structures are Black conferences or regional conferences, historically Black colleges and high schools. You have Pine Forge University, you got Oakwood College. There are others throughout the country that are designed by design. They are Black schools or minority schools or churches. No, not churches. But so those structures are intentional. Conferences and schools. Churches, however, particularly in-state conferences, are ethnic more by organic development than simply by a structure. And although they do exist, so an ethnic church might be a Korean church or a Hispanic church or a Filipino church, a Black church. Generally, we're gonna have issues if somebody said, yeah, but we're a white church. For whatever reason, we don't give them the same pass as the minority churches, saying we're going to have these specific entities to themselves because of the missional impact that we believe they make. So when we say ethnic structures, that's what we're talking about. Black conferences, Black schools. And I'm saying Black conferences because in theory, we don't really have white conferences by structure, right? They are that, were that in the 40s when they came out, but they did not come out and say, we are a white conference. It was just the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and culture kind of made it that. But by definition, in theory, it was supposed to be open to every nation, kindred, race, and tongue, all of that.
But this is also an American issue. This is something unique to the North American division, right?
Well, that's a good question.
I mean, I don't imagine we had the issue in the 90s. I don't think there was a Hutu conference and a Tutsi conference in Rwanda, was there?
No, but I'm pretty sure, someone can correct me on this, I'm pretty sure there are regional conferences of some variant in South Africa. I'm like 80% sure on that.
Interesting.
We may have some folk in our chat who are watching today that may be able to give us some more information on that.
Listen, let's put that out, Pastor Paul. Listen, if you know some information about that, put that in the chat. We would like to know.
Yeah.
I do know we did when the General Conference did their youth conference, General Conference Youth Congress. In 2013, in South Africa in particular, there wasn't a sense that it was a conference divided church, but more a cultural divided church. And so you have the Afrikaans who worshipped together. You had the different tribes that worshipped together in their own way. So I think there is some kind of cultural diversity that happens.
It's not the same as like our structure of regional conferences. Yes,
right.
Correct.
But once we got to the United States, once we got here, with the, remember there was also a convolution when the blacks who were brought over as slaves, they came from different tribes, and they were kind of forced to be together in a sense, in light of the fact that they were working on the plantation. But once they were freed, they didn't go back to being in their separate tribes. They were just lumped in as African Americans, and that is and because of the way the country or society looked at African Americans, we tend to now lump everybody in there. Now everyone is coming out and want to be Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Hispanic, and Afro-Latino, and Afro this and Afro that, or Latino this and Latino that, and it's really causing I shouldn't say it's causing a problem, but it's really going against what our structure has laid out before. And now we begin to ask the question, how do we minister to many of these cultures? And then we're looking at that through the eyes of a Caucasian-led church. I mean, to be honest with you. Yeah. And so when we're looking at it from a Caucasian-led church, we don't get a sense that there is a problem with the Caucasian church. There's always a problem with the other cultures that are around.
I wrestle with this because my first question to you is, who is we that has to minister to these people if they are ministering to each other? And like, why? Who is the we that has to do it? Because the whole point of the Adventist Church, even if you look at the GC's new strategic plan for the next 5 years, called I Will Go, the whole thing is about empowering local mission and empowering individual Adventists to do the ministry. So, and to carry out the mission. So who is the we that has to minister to anyone first? But secondly, I do think this is related, but Pastor Paul, I would counter to you had mentioned, like, why don't we also have white churches? And I would only counter that with, because for the entirety of Christianity's history from the medieval till now at least, is white church was just called church.
Right.
So the reason we have the different racially separated or designated churches is because you have to designate that this is not that. Our culture has, whatever white culture is, whatever we want to say white culture is, has just dominated the church culture and liturgy and everything for all of recent history, at least. So for me, it's like, I don't need white churches, because that, to me, that just says, that sounds defensive. Like I'm trying to maintain something that is somehow being stolen, some identity that's being stolen. And that's not the case at all. I am thrilled that there are churches that can meet the specific cultural needs, language needs, and individual needs of their members. So for me, when we ask, what do we do to minister that to them, I'd say whatever we can do to empower them and give them what they need to be able to minister to each other, while also reminding everyone of the narrative. And this is why I think there needs to be more cross-pollination and more partnership together between conferences, but also while reminding them of the greater family that they're a part of that is multicultural. And I think we need to have some sort of reckoning over what multicultural actually means when all of us are together. So there you go. I'm off my soapbox for the next 3 minutes.
But you know, the biggest issue is not necessarily the local church, because in the local church, as you pointed out, Ryan, we do gather together based on a singular commonality that we have, whether we're from Jamaica or whether we're from Trinidad or we're from the Midwest or down south. We tend to gather and we worship and we get excited about that. But the problem really comes when we move up the ladder to structure and mission. What type of conference are we going to have? Who will sit in the seats of leadership in those conferences? And once we get to those moments, that's when the problem becomes a real issue, because now blacks at the time were saying, wait a minute, we're not being seen in representation in leadership. And so what we're going to do about that? Oh, y'all have your own conference. So we go down that road. Now we have other ethnic groups. What about the Hispanics? What about the Koreans? I mean, there was this whole concept when they just had the vote for a new executive secretary for the North American division, and there was a lot of talk about whether it should be a Hispanic, and then it became a Korean American, and so some folks, there are some people who are saying, wait a minute, they haven't gone through their rites of passage to be elevated to that point. And don't get me wrong, I have no problems with the leadership. I have no problems with the ethnicity, but I'm sharing with you what some are thinking and some are talking about in terms of looking at our leadership and seeing the ethnic structures that are rising or getting the opportunity, while others are saying, wait a minute, what about us in this church?
I think for me, in my current state of ignorance, I think about like where my mind is still unsettled with the whole issue, and where I think my love for this church could go. If we were our best self, if we were to become the best Adventism that we could be, I think we would have to be included and incorporate everybody into the one umbrella. I don't think we can remain separate and continue the way we have been. I think about the power of what you just said there, Roger, the power of seeing someone like me on the stage, the power of calling the office and hearing someone like me, the power of knowing that there's someone in the room where decisions are getting made who will advocate for me. I think that's where we need to be as a church. How do we get there? I have no idea.
So here's a statement on the screen. It says, look at the mega churches or non-denominational churches. Why are they growing? Diversity. How will it be in heaven? Why not do what we know to be? Yeah. So it's from Marie Polo. Mm-hmm. And that kind of maybe speaks to some of the things that you were saying, Tim. But Ryan, yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
I've attended several mega churches and used to be very, very interested in that whole culture. I would disagree that it's diversity that gets them growing. I would actually agree that the missional impact, presence, and excitement in general I know a lot less Adventists who are excited to invite their friends to church than I do mega church people in general and mega church members. All right. I can only think of really two. I'm not going to say which two churches that I was excited to bring friends to and invite people to. And I hear that from Adventists on a consistent basis. Now, I would say that within the ethnic structure or within the actual structure of the church, if we're going to take away regional conferences from Black people, whoever we is, right, which we don't even have the power to do, but if we were going to do that, then is that not just as racist or prejudiced to take something away because of race? So in my mind, whatever I think the starting place is figuring out within our structure, how do we create proper representation at levels of leadership and decision making within the church? How do we intentionally include those groups in a way that is fair, in a way that is equitable, right? Because if we don't have that conversation, then there is then all we do is end regional conferences or end separate conferences, regardless if it's regional or state. We just end separate conferences in the NAD so that we can send a better message. But in reality, all we've done is take away representation, leadership, and authority and power from Black people, and we've replaced it with nothing other than whatever, we've not intentionally replaced it. I think there was a commenter on Facebook that talked about what the UK did with the Pearson package, and I don't know much about that. That's actually the first time I've seen that term or that name, but I would be interested in seeing some sort of proposal for what it would look like, or what proper racial representation would look like at all levels of leadership that allow for things like when Ted Wilson a couple of years ago said something racially insensitive at annual council, was immediately called out and called into a private meeting with all 9 regional conference presidents. And within 3 days, he didn't fully walk back what he said, but he did do something and acknowledge it at least, and gave some form of an apology. And so I think that needs to be able to happen for multiple races. That level of accountability needs to exist. And so my question is, and what I'm interested in seeing is, what does a proposed ethnic structure look like that allows for that representation if it's not through a conference structure specifically?
Yeah. Listen, we ran by something earlier that we didn't nail down, and I wanted to make sure that we got that. So as we were talking about the differences between intentional structures and organic structures, the question and you brought out some stuff just now, Ryan, that I thought spoke to that. So the intentional structures being conferences and schools that we set up as historically Black schools, and we've got Black conferences or regional conferences. Those things exist And the question is, if they did not exist, if they were merged, if you took a state conference and a regional conference and merged them at the conference level, do black churches all of a sudden disappear? Do Filipino churches disappear? Do those at the local level, do those things disappear? Would not still black churches, because we have this structure out on the West Coast, right? Or we only have this on the East Coast where we have these separate conferences that way. But couldn't people who still wanted to find a black worship experience, a Hispanic worship experience, even when they're not, even without having a regional conference in place, couldn't you still have those kind of experiences?
Yeah, that's one of my biggest points really against combining or re-merging, is that it's not really going to change anything at the church level, which is where functional Adventism takes place, or functional faith and faith practice takes place. So in my mind, it really is. This is why I say that regional and like whatever that merging of conferences looks like should be the last step in the process, not the first. It should be kind of like the crossing the finish line of dealing with prejudice and dealing with ethnic separation in our structure. That really should be the finish line, not the starting line. And unfortunately, that tends to be the starting place for quite a number of Adventists who also don't have the context around either history, which I didn't up until 2 years ago, or finances, or anything like that. So I would agree with you, Pastor Paul, that they're really, like, I don't know that really changes anything at a functional level unless every single one of those groups is willing to give that up in order to join together under one roof.
But I think that, with our structure, I think the whole point of having structure is to facilitate growth, right? And so, we put the regional conferences in place so that we can grow, and we've seen that, happen effectively. I guess the deeper question now is, if there is a restructuring of the conferences within our division, would that, just based on your perspective, would that facilitate the Caucasian growth? Because again, I think that what we're trying to do is to grow the church. We're trying to, I guess the term that you use, I think is a real good term. We're trying to make more Adventists, right? We're trying to make more Adventists, but or Christians. We should say Christians. But would the merging, would that help the Caucasian growth? What are some of the obstacles? And I like you touched on this before, but would that help the Caucasian growth?
I'm not going to let you deflect away from my question yet, Dr. Henry. We're going to come to that, but I want to make sure that we get to that point. The question is that still is there before we move on to that one. The idea that we are always saying, or almost saying, that black churches would not grow if you did not have black conferences, or if conferences were merged, or that Hispanic churches would not grow. Of course, we don't have Hispanic conferences. We don't have Korean conferences. We don't have Filipino conferences. So that being on the table, if we're saying that the black church grew and is still growing, not just grew, we know the history of it. They did grow because we had that then. I think that's a more difficult case to make now, because we are seeing black churches grow in state conferences. We are seeing evangelism in black communities, and we try to ignore it within the black community. I'm going to put it out there. I know I'm getting myself in trouble, but we ignore it. But it's facts. There's data behind that says these churches are growing. Evangelism is happening outside in the black community, outside of regional conferences. To maintain the argument and say that we have to have regional conferences in order for the black church to continue to grow, it is not as supported as we think with the data that we see now in 2020, or is it? So the other side of that is then, if it is, then does that make the case stronger to say, well, then if we want the Hispanic church to grow the same way, then should not we have Hispanic conferences? If we want Filipino churches to grow, shouldn't we have Filipino conferences and Korean conferences, et cetera, et cetera?
I I'm sorry, I keep talking a lot. If someone else wants to talk, I'm happy to.
So do I.
Maybe
we let these two go for it.
I mean, I'm happy to answer. I don't have a problem with it. I built my soapbox yesterday, and I've been sitting on it all the podcast long. In my mind, when you talk about it from a structure perspective, I don't I see it as a matter of growth, but really I see it as a matter of representation. I see it as a matter of authority and decision making and that level of a say in what happens within the greater church family, not just within our silos. So for me, that's why the whatever question we're asking about ethnic structures needs to be answered by including some form of intentional representation for the different racial groups within the church. I think that is important, and I do think that something like that is reflected within Christ's model as well, of that form of representation and that form of authority being given. And that's how I feel about that.
Okay, Tim, any thoughts on that? And we're coming. Dion, I'm sorry, man, but we'll come back. We'll get to that.
And I might have forgotten the question now.
Yeah, repeat the question just so we're all. Yeah.
How do we actually serve the white community? Is that essentially how do we?
Yeah, going back to it. So again, I think the critical thing, I guess for me, is what obstacles are there in the Caucasian growth. We talk about merging, and the question, I guess, was asked by Anselm or Pastor Paul. The black church is growing in different areas, right? But the Caucasian growth, what do you think will facilitate more growth in the Caucasian community?
I can only speak to my own experiences. I can tell you right now here in Kansas-Nebraska conference, we have 51 pastors employed in our conference, and about 40% of them are not white. And that's kind of surprising considering how many you think when you think of Kansas and Nebraska. Like 40%, that's not bad representation. So we have constituency coming up, and in some wild, crazy world, let's say that we go and try and get a new president, right? I would not like that because I like our president. But let's just say, for example, that were a thing. We have 40% already in leadership positions that represent minority groups, if we want to use that word. We have 40% that are not white that could easily represent their members as they grow and as they look and say, I want a president like me. That's not bad, but not all of our conferences have that same kind of representation at the beginning coming into a constituency season. Do you know what I mean? Like we have to have the presence first before we can promote. And if we don't have that sort of respect and ability to move up within the institution, what is the hope for change? What will we look like unless there's a forced merging? I don't know how that could happen.
Well, I don't know. I think you have a population problem within North America as well. Just within the U.S., I think the U.S. is on track to be a majority minority country by 2044. Right. So the idea is, why isn't the white church growing? Because proportionally to, on top of the fact that we're losing a lot of us, proportional to population growth statistics, white people are shrinking in general. Smaller household family. I remember reading a study 5 or 6 years ago that, and I don't know what the status on this is in general, but that there were reports that the UK or Europe in general, I don't remember which of the two, I think it was Europe, was going to was on track to be majority Muslim because of the influx of Muslim refugees that also have larger families. And it was just by birth rate, just by the amount of kids you have. Naturally, I believe it was Europe as a whole that was going to become and end up being a Muslim place, specifically just because of birth rate, not even because of evangelism or conversions. And I would say I am concerned for white people. I am, and I don't want to say I'm not there. I don't want to imply that I'm not. But I also don't want to make it more of an emergency than it is when population growth statistics tend to mirror that reality as well, that we would make up a smaller percentage of the church over time. And I'm fine with that. And I don't have a definite answer, I think, to the specific question of how do we reach white people, other than to agree with something Tim said earlier about being more intentional about creating familial ties and a more communal experience for our churches.
Interesting comment here says, who makes up the white church?
I was just thinking that.
White is not a culture.
Yeah.
So when we think about, typically, if you've got white people, they're of German heritage, they're of Irish heritage, they're of, whatever else, English. And those are cultures. Granted, they're places, but they're cultures.
Right.
So when we say white, who makes up the white church? What are we talking about when we say that?
Yeah.
When we say the black church, what are we saying? I think there's a reality there as well. Great. And I'm not trying to deflect.
No, not deflecting, but it's a great segue into a previous comment that says that Cleveland says this. He says, we're not growing indigenous people anywhere. So when we say that the black church is growing more than the white church, the reality in most of our conferences, whether the conferences that are growing are not growing with African Americans, they're not growing with white people, they're growing with immigrants. It's the immigrant populations in both conferences that are swelling numbers. When you're seeing growth, it's not happening with third, fourth, fifth, sixth generation black people. It's your first, second, maybe third generation indigenous people. So from Haiti, from the islands, from Jamaica, etc. That's where our growth is coming from. So the reality is that, that question, who makes up the white church, but also who makes up the black church, both of them, I think, are relevant questions if we're talking about how are these structures that we have really impacting the mission of the church.
Well, so can I circle this all the way back to something that we talked about at the beginning regarding and I think Nestor Osorio in the comments spoke to this as well, that the way that we do data and the way that we prioritize data and what we think is important is naturally flawed and lends itself to a lot of corruption. And I'm going to air some dirty laundry here, not mine, unfortunately. But have you ever heard the term rice Adventist? There are, and I've seen missionaries come back and report this firsthand as well. There are entire villages, entire towns in other countries where basically the church would give out rice. And to anyone who would come and but you had to end up becoming baptized within the Adventist church. So What ended up happening was basically you have entire villages or towns that are Adventist and are counted among members, but none of them have ever set foot in that church. They just did it so that they could get
some rice.
Get some rice. And you have this. There was questions about auditing that came up at I think last year's annual council and potentially the year before, as we've talked about policy and who's out of compliance, policy compliance, that whole theme. But auditing church number and church membership reports, that's something that we're not talking about, I think, as much as we need to. And the only reason I bring that up now is because I think we also fall into the trap of trying to compare ourselves to other divisions, countries, and cities that have these explosions of membership growth. And I'm not saying that I don't trust those numbers entirely, but I do think that there's reason for us to at least question or pause before we start to say that we're failing when there is equal reason across the entire global church to flub numbers, especially if flubbing those numbers means that we get increased representation at things like General Conference session where world church matters are decided. So I'm just careful to play a comparison game to say oh no, we're falling behind these other countries or these other places. I'm hesitant there, and it is, and yeah, I'm just going to let that be what it is.
So what's the trade-off in the North American division, though? I mean, if we're not handing out bowls of rice, what are we handing out? Are we handing out community? Are we handing out belonging? Are we handing out family? Like, what is it that? And maybe that's the question. The answer to what you said before is, how do we get white churches to grow? Maybe we need to figure out what we're selling. I mean, if we're selling judgment, they're not going to come. If we're selling heartaches and lists of things to do, they're not going to come. So, maybe we need to figure out what our bowl of rice is so that it's not manipulative, but so that it's actually mission driven.
I read one of our, should I say, let me just say, I heard a pastor, a white pastor, put this explanation out as to why we were not seeing significant growth in the white church community, and particularly in students in seminary. So we're graduating even fewer white pastors or young people wanting to be pastors from our seminaries. And he said it like this. He said that when you look around, and he was not talking about third country, he's talking about in North America. When you look around North America, he's saying the church is increasingly being dominated and led by immigrants, and particularly immigrants who come here and import their worship style, their sense of what church is and how it's supposed to operate. And it is a foreign concept to a lot of indigenous people. Now, he was specifically talking about white young people. And so they're bringing what we did back home and saying, this is what church is, this is how church operates. And because they are the growing and dominant force in North America, he's saying that white young people are looking at that and saying, I cannot identify with that. That's not in my comfort zone. I don't understand that. It's foreign to me. And so I'm not going to be a part. What was ironic to me was this, is that those young people, those immigrants, what the Adventism that they are bringing here was exported to them by white Adventist missionaries going over there and saying, this is what Adventism is. They bought it. They took something that was out of their comfort zone, that was unfamiliar with them. They bought it, they accepted it, and in places like Jamaica, where we have the highest concentration of Adventists in any other country in the world, they come over here and they are bringing back white Adventist, white colonialized Adventism, and now white people can't adjust to something that they exported. Now, there's certainly some tweaks to it, but there's a whole heap of irony in that whole scenario. There's even more irony in the fact that there is, if you're talking about indigenous people as white people, we weren't indigenous either. Like the culture that we're used to is also an imported culture, because I'm not going to say the entire division, but really, this whole basically all of the U.S. is an immigrant country from its foundation. And as a country, by the way, I'm not saying as a land. This land was not the United States land when we got here. Okay, so I want to make sure that I'm sensitive to that reality too. But so there needs to be some sort of education on history, like real history, to understand, like, we're not used to this thing. This is what it's always been. Well, what it's always been also wasn't original to here either. So you sign up to be a missionary, right? You're maybe finishing up your MDiv at Andrews, and you see the Adventist Frontier Missions booth, and you go and talk to them, and you sign up. You get these classes on contextualization. How do you meet the culture where they are? How do you come in and not offend? How do you come into their context and speak their language in a way that they'll listen and want to be a part of what you're selling? We don't do that for our churches here. We don't do that for our pastors entering into ministry in rural Kansas. We don't do that for any other, well, maybe we do, and I just have not been blessed with that opportunity, but
Like, we don't contextualize what it means to be a person in 2020 in the United States. And then you add into that all of the generational diversity and different ways of seeing things. You add to that the gender differences. You add to that the racial cultural differences. You add to that family traditions, geographic diversity. Like, there's just so many ways that we're different. And yet when we throw a pastor into a new church, we plug him in. We installed Dion this morning, right? We plug you into your new church, but what do you know about your church? What do you know about your people? Like, how do we prepare our pastors for diving into this new context, which all they really have to lean on is what they've done at their other churches?
Wow.
So when trying to, reach mission, we have these structures in place. What are your suggestions? What are some things that we can do? And I think you mentioned it, both of you mentioned it as we went through the show, but what are your suggestions on what we can do as pastors, as administrators to grow community? Should we, stick with the structure that we have now? Is that effective? Are there some different ideas that might be more effective, especially here in North America?
I think listening to your people is the best thing that any new pastor can do. I mean, when you go into a new church, there's always that, what was that leadership phrase? I can't remember who it was that said, beware of the first person that comes to you and tells you that, this is what you need to know. But I think there's a lot of truth to listening to the people. In our Growing Young study, we've got this thing like listening is the best thing, right? Listening leaders. You want to be the leader who listens to the people instead of telling them what your plan is. You want to hear what they need. And I feel like too many of us dive into a new place and try and correct and fix things that have been broken by previous leaders, instead of just sitting back and listening to what their actual spiritual needs are.
Yeah.
And I would add to that. I think there's a need for us to, there's a problem in our discipleship because our discipleship naturally has a ceiling. Our model of discipleship has a ceiling, and the ceiling, and this is true of any Christian denomination, by the way, the ceiling is involvement or membership at a local church. In other words, you don't go further than that, because if you go further than that, you're not contributing financially. Like the church loses if you grow and do something that is beyond these walls and not inherently connected to these walls. And so I do think that there is a need for us to uncap discipleship that way. But I think we do need to do better with understanding race relations and understanding racial history, especially in America. And especially when you look at the country, especially when you look at the state of the country just within the last 4 years. And if anyone thinks I'm about to attack Trump, I'm actually not attacking Trump because I either dislike Trump or I dislike the GOP. All I'm going to say is this.
There's just data that says it.
If you're embracing prophetic Adventism, which is the aspect of Adventism that we claim makes us unique, there is a certain reality in our country that prophetic Adventism actually points to. And I think that there is a need for us to actually re-embrace the so-called apocalyptic Adventism, though I don't want to go all that direction. But I think there is a need to embrace that in a way that also challenges us to action now, or calls us to action now. Most of the way that I see prophecy and our prophetic interpretations applied is as foreknowledge, or as you don't be you be on the lookout for this stuff. But if this is a prophetic reality that we have as far as the end times are concerned and how things get worse over time, shouldn't the majority of our ministry be aiming to serve the people that are being oppressed by those in power as things are getting worse and those making it worse? Shouldn't we be called to more action instead of only more study, or only sharing some Bible study pamphlets with people? I think, and this goes back to the megachurch thing earlier. One of the biggest reasons I see megachurches grow is because they're active. They're actively making a difference. At the beginning of the shutdown, there's a megachurch here in Chattanooga that opened its doors for a drive-through kind of food pantry where you could come in and get meals, and they were taking volunteers regardless of background or faith, regardless of belief system. They were taking volunteers to help pass that food out, obviously with following as many safety precautions as possible. And while I don't necessarily condone like mass gatherings, or, you know, I'm skeptical of food being handed out during a pandemic, you know, where something is so easily transferable or transmittable. I think that there is a need for us to take action in our communities and in our cities. And that starts by finding out what is needed there and listening. So, yeah.
So, you know, picking up off of that, Ryan, for just a minute, the nerd in me couldn't let the moment pass without referencing what Barna has been doing. Barna has this collaboration with Glue for their State of the Church study that came out right in the middle of the pandemic. And they took this opportunity to convert a study that was going to be exclusively to pastors and make it available to all local churches to understand the needs of their congregations during these crazy times. And so each week you can send out almost, I think it's like 30 different surveys of all sorts of things, from what are your needs to how is your anxiety to how bad is the coronavirus in your area. I mean, these are free tools that Barna has put together for people. And it's one of the best ways of finding out what the actual needs in your actual congregation are. And they pair that up with the regional data of your city to say, your church is doing okay according to everyone else in your church's community. And that kind of brought me back to what you were saying, Ryan. Ministry of healing, Christ's method alone will give true success in reaching the people. The Savior mingled with people as one who desired their good. And then he showed sympathy for them. He ministered to their needs, and he won their confidence. And then he said, "Follow me." And the rest of the quote is just as powerful. But I think we're kind of coming back to the main theme of, who are your people? What do they need? And how can I serve you? Which is very different from, hey guys, look at me. I'm the master. Let me tell you what I know.
And it's different from the idea of, and this is a reality, the in the world, not of the world. And the avoid the appearance of evil, that is a misunderstanding of that text, by the way, has caused us to silo ourselves to say that our churches are a safe haven or protection against everything outside, instead of as something meant to go serve the world outside.
Yeah.
And so that whole idea of being set apart has caused us, we've overdone it in that area. And as a result, we expect people to come to us for something that they don't even know that they need or accept that they need, or even know if we even offer it. And in reality, we should be going out and doing what we can to actually serve. And yes, there are practical ways to do it. But I'd say the first thing to do is to actually start listening, and listen by attending a town hall in your city. Listen by listening to the protests, regardless of whether you agree with protests. That's a huge chunk of your city.
Yeah.
So I think there are ways that we can listen and identify needs, and then begin to actually make those needs a priority in order to meet them.
Yeah.
Dr. Henry, this is our last program of this season. There's one more question that I'd like to throw out that may take us over our time. It says we got about 2 minutes left. Can I throw this one other question out, because Ryan just kind of gave me a segue to go there. Is that a yes?
Yes, sir. 10
Okay.
minutes.
All right. If our guest will indulge us. So as we look at the political climate around the United States now, and we see the polarization that is happening in the culture around us, we are seeing some of those same elements pop up within the church. We are seeing lines being drawn. If you say, as a white pastor or a black person, that Black Lives Matter, all of a sudden you are Marxist, you are what's a spiritualist, whatever, etc. If you say, I want to make America great again, all of a sudden you are a racist, you are etc. And and the Bible doesn't want us getting involved. The Adventist church has no business being involved in marches or in protest, etc. We're seeing the same type of polarizations take place within the church. I have listened to white pastor friends talk about they're being pummeled by their members because they preached a sermon on social justice. and that white members are dogging them. We have seen where people feel that black people are against white people, when black people in the church, it's explicitly, you always going to have some, but to be against racism is not the same thing as being against white people, or hating racism is not the same thing as hating. And so how are you guys seeing among white Adventists, what's the temperature gauge, or what's happening throughout? I know you're Tim. You've got a whole conference that you work with. You've got friends in different places. Ryan, what's your gauge? Most of our audience is probably African American, Caribbean American, and I think they have that question. What's the temperature gauge? What's going on in white Adventism as it pertains to some of these current issues in the larger culture?
It's spicy.
Which is ironic, given that we're talking about white people.
Yeah, I don't think I go a week without hearing from one of the pastors that I work with a tension that has arisen in their congregation from something around one of the things you just said. And we have, when you think of Kansas-Nebraska, the first thought probably is rural, but the majority of our membership are in larger cities. Kansas City, Omaha, Lincoln, Wichita, those are all, fairly good size bases of population. We're looking at around 500,000 or so, which there's a lot of diversity in those larger cities. And so when you have a church that is predominantly white, or has very small pockets of diversity within that congregation, that is trying to serve a larger population that is reacting to the climate of their city and to the rest of the country, it's going to cause some tension. And we have a lot of amazing pastors in our conference who have been trying to stick to the Word of God and be a compassionate voice of reason and off balance some of the more difficult perspectives that are out there. Having said that, we also have some pastors who are on the other side of that line. And so it does get complicated really quickly in the Midwest, at least.
I think you really do have three kind of major groups, right? You have the people that don't buy into Black Lives Matter at all. Think all of that is whatever it might be, whether it's conspiratorial or just disagree with methods or disagree with, a small percentage of the protests turning violent, whatever they might feel. They're against that. Then you've got others who err on the side of white guilt, who go overboard. And I think that's where a lot of the calls for the end of regional conferences or separate conferences come from. And then you've got those that are kind of in the middle, or not even in the middle, but I actually would just make it a third category altogether of those who accept or acknowledge the reality of racial tensions and of a racial divide, and are actively doing the work of anti-racism too. I think, and then you've got tensions between those three groups. And here's how I would cap off as well answering this question. There was a comment saying that our church, a couple comments talking about safe churches and where, we need to be safe places for people. And I would challenge that in all of the love that I can by saying this: every single church is a safe place. The question isn't how do we become a safe place? The question, and this is going to be a reckoning for many churches, is who exactly are we a safe place for?
Wow.
Because if I'm not going to say Black Lives Matter, I'm going to stand up against that organization. I am a safe place for a very specific group of people.
Mercy.
And do those people need a safe place for that kind of view? Do I need or do we need a safe place for anti-racism? Like it's all a safe place. Who are you creating a safe place for? Because our desire to be neutral, our desire to not speak into political realities, or our desire to not endorse one candidate or the other, means that we are actively enabling whoever does get power. You neutrality is a side, and I don't want to make it a side versus side thing necessarily, but I hope everyone understands the heart of that statement, that neutrality is picking someone. It's picking something, whether it's a stance, a soapbox, a people group, whatever political party, but you're making your church is a safe place for someone. Look around. Who feels safe in your church? Yeah. And are those the people that should feel safe in your church?
Wow. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's huge. Ryan, I'm seeing comments saying, boom. I mean, mercy. These are, our time is well spent today. But we got to have you guys back. This was a really good conversation. Some good dipping into it. I feel like we've just only got our toes in the water.
Yeah. Barely scratched the surface.
You know, we do an hour and a half, and we've been an hour and 5 minutes beyond that today. But we just want to just affirm both of you so much. We appreciate you taking the time and the opportunity to come and be with us today. Yes, Tim?
I just want to say, like, for those of you watching, this is what needs to happen for our church. You know, you don't need to get onto a podcast or a vlog or something, but these conversations, I feel like this is what needs to happen in our church. If we're ever going to be our brother's keeper and take care of each other and be a cheerleader for each other, we need to have these conversations. And it might get really, really awkward for a while before we get to the healing, but I feel like this is crucial. Thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this.
Hey, look, we got to give a special shout out to Tim, because Tim, we had some other guests that fell through last minute, and Tim took the invitation just this morning to come on today. So Tim, big ups to you, man. Thank you so very much. We know that God is going to do some great stuff with you and your young people out there in Nebraska, and what's the other one? Kansas, Nebraska. So thank you again so very much. And Ryan, you up there at Chattanooga, Crosswalk, we're going to continue to lift you up and have you in prayer for what you guys are doing there. We appreciate your candor, your honesty, your bravery even, and coming on here and having this kind of a conversation. And I agree, we need to do more. Dr. Henry, would you do the honors of taking us out today, man?
We're going to take him out, but again, before we go out, listen, we started on this road, how many weeks ago, Pastor Paul? Maybe 26, 27?
26. We skipped 1 week. We missed 1 week. Other than that, we've been out 20. This is the 25th. No, 23. I'm sorry. So it's been 24 weeks today. 24
weeks. This has been a good journey. And I want to tell our listeners, we have some special things happening in season 2. You think that these conversations were energizing, engaging. You wait till season 2. We're going to bring out some other things, and we're going to revisit some of the things that we talked about here. And you know what? We just don't want this to be a show where we just talk, right? We want to do some action.
That's
okay?
Right.
So as we talk and as we engage, we want to call our viewers to action. And that is, let's do mission. Let's reach people for Jesus Christ, right?
Oh, yeah.
Let's do what we can. And let us be sensitive to the cultures in where we live, so that we can make sure that we include them in the mission process. And I think that's why God has us in these various places. Look, thank you for listening to the Pastors Roundtable. It's been a joy being with you. And this is where we make ministry relevant.
Oh, wait. Hold on. I got it. I'm sorry. We're going to come back. I'm sorry. Listen, we want you guys, I know you guys appreciate our guest as well. And before we get to our close, we want to give our audience an opportunity to follow up with our guests. So Ryan, you've got a podcast, you've got someone. Tell us about how our listeners can follow up with you, can hear some more from you. Just give us in 20 seconds, how can they reach out? He normally will put that in the chat there, but go ahead and do that, Ryan. Tell us the name of the podcast, what you're doing, how they can follow up.
Yeah, so I've got the Absurdity podcast, Absurdity or theabsurdity.org. I've got the Absurd Podcast Network, which is that A that's above me. Absurdnetwork.com has a bunch of shows, but I have 2 shows on there, A Beautiful Faith and Absurdity. I've got the Echo podcast with the Carolina Conference, and I have a personal YouTube channel. And just search for Ryan Becker and find me there. And I'm on my way to 1,000 subscribers and 4,000 watch hours. I'm at 430 subs and over 1,000 watch hours right now, and I've got little over 6 months left of time. So help me and support me so that I can have that channel begin to support me and as well. So, but yes, those are the main ways that you can connect with me.
Good, awesome, and we'll put some of that information on the web page as well, or on the Facebook page as well. Tim, anything special you got going on you want to share with our audience before we close out?
No, man, I'm just serving people, but I do strongly recommend Ryan's podcast. It's fantastic. He's hitting some relevant issues that are really great conversations and interaction. So hit that up.
All right. We want to remind you, I see Doc Bushner in the chat today. He's reminding us to go and vote, register to vote, get your voices heard out there. We want to remind you to do that, vote.org. There's places that you can go to make that happen. Before we sign off today, we want to make sure that we know who's watching today. So in the chat, if you just put in your home state, your home conference, your home church, just shout out where you're from. We want to acknowledge you and celebrate the fact that you're here. A lot of other podcasts or things like that. I see Pastor Scott in the chat today. You want to check out he and Austin Humphrey's show that they have going on. Awesome stuff that's happening. Quarantine Revival is still going on. Those of you that are familiar with that, we want to support each other in times like this. So reach out, find out what's going on. Just some awesome stuff. And Dr. Henry, before I interrupted you, you were telling our guests for the last time for this season that.
But wait a minute.
Oh.
For the next 2 weeks, we are. Did we tell? We didn't even talk about the next 2 weeks.
We didn't tell them. Good.
The next week we are going to be showing reruns, but it's going to be exciting ones. So we want you to stay tuned with that. And we will be back for season 2, and season 2 will begin on October the 5th.
First weekend in October.
First weekend of October, which is October. Let me get that date right. There you go.
Queens,
October
New
the
York.
3rd.
Yes.
And that will be season number 2. So again, call your friends. Let them know that just because they're not going to see a new episode next week doesn't mean the Pastors Roundtable has gone away. We are still here talking about resources, making it relevant, and making it real. I just did all of them, Pastor Paul.
You forgot resource. Hey, listen, subscribe to the channel, the Facebook, not the Facebook channel, the YouTube channel. Join the Facebook group. Follow the Facebook page. We're going to try to get out a lot of extra stuff over the next few weeks that you can learn some more in-depth things about the topics we've discussed. Thank you so much for supporting us in this first season. We look forward to seeing you next season. God bless everybody. We got to go back. We're still here, you guys. We didn't tell him about TJ. We wanted to give TJ a shout out before we left. Listen, TJ is always behind the scenes. You guys don't know TJ. We're going to introduce you to TJ, but you're going to see TJ in the next season. Go ahead, Dion.
This is what happens when we don't practice. Is TJ here? Is he coming on?
I don't know if we got him on, but we're going to make sure that you meet TJ in the next week. I don't know if TJ comes on, but listen, TJ has done a whole lot of work for us, and we didn't want to end this season without saying thank you to TJ. He kind of consults with us, gives us some feedback, all that kind of stuff. So our bad, TJ, but we didn't want to leave you out. Thank you, man. We appreciate you. We know that you didn't get to see Roger as we finished out the season, but he's going to be back with us at the beginning of season 2. God bless you.
Your love, man. Your love.
Good stuff. All right, now we're out. Should I play the outro again? No? Yes. Here we go.
Hey,